Poverty is rarely accidental. Most nations that remain poor today are trapped in systems carefully designed, historically evolved, and politically maintained to ensure their dependence. Being poor is not simply a result of lack of talent, resources, or effort. It is often the outcome of historical exploitation, structural disadvantage, and ongoing financial, political, and economic mechanisms that limit growth. Understanding how poor countries are kept poor requires examining history, global finance, trade, politics, and systemic power. Historically, many poor nations suffered colonization. European powers, between the 15th and 20th centuries, conquered vast regions in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Colonization was primarily economic. Colonizers extracted raw materials, used forced labor, and limited local industry. Colonial administrations focused on resource extraction, not local development. Railroads, ports, and infrastructure were built to transport resources to Europe, not to develop domestic economies. After independence, these nations inherited borders, institutions, and economies designed for exploitation, not self-sufficiency. Debt is another major mechanism. Poor countries often rely on loans from wealthy nations or global institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. While these loans are presented as aid or development funds, they come with strict conditions. Nations must implement policies favoring foreign investors, reduce social spending, privatize resources, and open markets. While these policies ensure repayment, they often hinder domestic growth and perpetuate inequality. Loan cycles keep nations dependent, as new loans are taken to pay off old ones, creating a trap of structural debt. Trade systems also favor rich nations. Poor countries often export raw materials and import finished goods. This creates a dependency on global markets controlled by rich nations. Commodity prices fluctuate, leaving poor countries vulnerable to global shocks. Additionally, trade agreements often impose restrictions, tariffs, or quotas that benefit wealthy economies while limiting local industries. Developing countries rarely have the bargaining power to protect domestic growth or enforce fair trade practices. Currency manipulation is another subtle method of control. Many poor countries rely on foreign currencies, particularly the US dollar, for trade. This dependence makes them vulnerable to exchange rate fluctuations, interest rate changes, and inflation originating abroad. When rich nations adjust monetary policies, poor nations must respond, often at great cost to their populations. Control of global finance allows rich countries to influence poorer nations without direct conflict. Political instability is often not accidental. Weak institutions, corruption, and internal conflict are sometimes exacerbated by external influence. During the Cold War, superpowers supported certain leaders or factions in poor nations to maintain access to resources, markets, or strategic locations. Even today, foreign intervention in governance, aid conditionality, and economic pressure shape political outcomes, sometimes prioritizing global interests over domestic welfare. Technology and knowledge transfer also favor wealthy nations. Rich countries maintain intellectual property, control advanced machinery, and dominate research. Poor countries often lack access to high-tech industries and modern infrastructure, forcing them to rely on imports. This limits domestic innovation and keeps economies dependent on external expertise and capital. Education and health disparities reinforce poverty. Systems in poor countries often remain underfunded, partly due to structural debt obligations and global economic pressures. Low investment in education and healthcare limits human capital, reducing productivity, innovation, and long-term growth. Populations remain trapped in cycles of subsistence and survival rather than development and wealth creation. Global aid, though often presented as help, can unintentionally perpetuate dependence. Humanitarian programs, while necessary in crises, sometimes prioritize short-term relief over sustainable development. Without careful planning, aid becomes a temporary solution rather than a tool for empowerment. In some cases, aid even supports corrupt governments, allowing systemic problems to continue. Natural resources, which should be a source of wealth, often become a curse. Many poor nations are rich in oil, minerals, or fertile land. Yet global systems ensure that profits from these resources flow abroad. Multinational corporations extract raw materials under favorable contracts, while local populations see limited benefit. This phenomenon, known as the resource curse, traps countries in cycles of extraction without development. The media and narratives also play a role. Global discourse often portrays poor countries as incapable, corrupt, or doomed, rather than as nations facing systemic challenges. This perception affects investment, international policy, and domestic morale. When a nation's population internalizes the belief that poverty is inevitable, social mobility and national ambition are weakened. Cultural and social pressures interact with economic control. In countries where survival dominates daily life, long-term planning, entrepreneurship, and innovation are secondary. Families and communities focus on immediate needs rather than capital accumulation or strategic investment. While individuals may strive for success, systemic obstacles limit opportunities. In recent decades, globalization has created new dependencies. Poor countries are often integrated into global supply chains in subordinate roles, cheap labor, raw material production, or agricultural exports. Wealth is extracted, value-added industries are limited, and profits are concentrated abroad. Multinational corporations dominate markets, while local businesses struggle to compete. Climate change and environmental pressures also exacerbate poverty. Poor nations face natural disasters, droughts, and rising sea levels, which destroy infrastructure, reduce agricultural output, and force populations into survival mode. Wealthy nations, while contributing disproportionately to climate change, possess resources to adapt, reinforcing inequality. Ultimately, poor countries are kept poor through a combination of historical exploitation, financial dependence, trade imbalance, technological inequality, political manipulation, and systemic structures designed to favor the wealthy. Poverty is not simply the absence of wealth, it is the presence of systems that reinforce subordination and limit opportunity. Breaking free requires more than effort or good governance. It demands restructuring global systems, reforming debt and trade policies, investing in human capital, and reclaiming political and financial sovereignty. Rich nations remain rich because they control the rules. Poor nations remain poor because those rules were never designed for their prosperity. Understanding how poor countries are kept poor is crucial for anyone seeking to change the global balance of power. It is a story of money, influence, control, and invisible mechanisms that shape human destiny. Recognizing these forces is the first step toward justice, equality, and sustainable development.